So the earliest version of Have Heart began right around when I started my young adult novel career. So back in like 2007, actually. It was one of the initial pitches that I sent to who would become my editor for Happy Face, my first book. The original thought was just doing kind of a science fiction epic about a lost boy trying to find himself. There wasn't a whole lot there. I wasn't chosen, so I kind of abandoned the thought. After Happy Face, around 2010, the idea came back up, and I wanted to do something more ambitious for my second project. So my first project was young adult novel, character-based, very slice-of-life, realistic. So I wanted to do something that would expand and be commercial and maybe do like a book series. I wanted something that was going to be really big in scope. So I went to the Odyssey as kind of a template, Homer's The Odyssey. I went with this idea of this kid kind of traveling, but spiritually traveling. So his body was still in one place in his home, but spiritually he was going into this kind of quantum world where he would discover everything underneath everything. That was going to be the story of Odie Spencer. And that was an idea that caused a lot of headaches for myself and for Connie, my editor. So Have Heart, which was always the title, it was always called Have Heart. I think the initial title was Have Heart, Your Soul Will Triumph. There were 3 parts to it. It was very epic, very grand. So the idea was that Odie would use this machine that would break his body down into atoms, and his consciousness would survive. And he went into this quantum world. And I started reading these articles about quantum theory and quantum physics, and about how maybe the human soul and heaven and the afterlife is all tied up into quantum physics and quantum theory. This world of the soul that's not of the body, that if we weren't tied to our body, we could immerse ourselves in. So I had all these ideas about Odie going back and forth between reality and this quantum soul world, searching for this missing girl, this friend of his. And I would send Connie all these articles like, look, this one kind of says that it's real, that it happens. This is the quantum world. This is what I have to figure out. So we got to figure out how the machine works and how we're going to break down these particles, and there were going to be all these gods in the quantum world that controlled things, and there were all going to be these female gods. There were going to be these different girls that would teach him different things as he's repairing his soul in this quantum heaven purgatory world. And I would drive Connie nuts with these emails and these articles, and I'd be like, did you read it? Did you read it? She'd be like, Steve, I don't know what you want me to do. I don't know anything about quantum physics. And I didn't know anything about quantum physics. I'm not a scientist. She pointed out that a lot of people have spent their lives trying to do the Odyssey, and that it's not an easy story to tell for your second book. So eventually I thought of Wintertown. I thought of, a kid that lives in a New England town and sees this girl every winter, and that became my second book. It was much more simple, but Have Heart would always come back. Some of the inspirations for Have Heart have remained consistent. Donnie Darko has always been a big one. I kind of liked this kind of young adult coming of age story. School and girls and life's tough and classes are hard, mixed with, all the big philosophizing and crazy events and ghosts and imaginary things. I was very drawn to all that being tied into a young adult story. Final Fantasy, the video game series, was kind of a big influence. Just this idea of kind of a team of people traveling and getting to know each other while also fighting the enemy. And in the same regard, the Persona game series were always about these high school kids that would have their friendships and their relationships and their school life mixed with solving a big mystery. Neon Genesis Evangelion. That was a big influence. That was another one that's about a teenager dealing with a lot of angst and the emotions of being a teenager, but mixed with giant robots and the apocalypse. I guess I'm very drawn to the idea of taking the otherworldly, the grand, the epic, and kind of telling a very common story about going through adolescence, becoming an adult, that transition from youth to adult, and how sometimes that feels like the end of the world. One of my big talking points when I was initially pitching Have Heart, maybe not the first time or the second time, but the third or fourth time I was trying to tell this story, I had this idea of doing it kind of as I want to say Mobius strip. I don't know if that's the correct term or not, but the idea of a circular story that kind of the beginning feeds into the end, which feeds back into the beginning. And part of that was I wanted to tell 2 stories in one book. This was still being pitched as young adult at the time. I was going to do another illustrated novel as I'd done with Happy Face in Wintertown. And so I wanted to have 2 stories that were the same characters, kind of an inverse of each other, right? And if you read the story from one side, it would be optimistic. You would read halfway through and then you'd flip the book over. The other half would be upside down and you'd read the other story. And if you read them in a certain order, it ended on an optimistic note. And if you read them in the second order, it would end on kind of a down note. So basically it was a story that kind of started high, had a low middle, but then brought itself back up by the end. Or depending on how you read it, it could start low, go to a high point, and then end low. So it could be read in multiple different ways and tell a different story depending on how you read it in which order. If the glass is half full, start here. And if the glass is half empty, start here. It was the same story, just very different depending on what order you read it in. So when I was trying to figure out Have Heart, another breakthrough came in around 2016. After Bright Lights, Dark Nights, I came back to this story again. I finally decided that doing it as a science fiction story was not going to work for me. Doing the quantum physics, the quantum theory, the purgatory, atoms and molecules, it was too much. I couldn't figure it out. But maybe it wasn't a science fiction story. Maybe it was a ghost story. I knew it was going to have dark elements. I knew that there was a girl that was missing and it was likely something bad happened to her. I knew it was a kid with a lot of broken insides trying to fix what's wrong with him. So it was going to be a heavy story. And it kind of dawned on me that this was a ghost story. This was somebody that was haunted and there were sinister forces at play. And this was somebody that was haunted by literal ghosts and metaphorical ghosts. The question became, could it be a ghost story without being full-on horror? I was still trying to do young adult novels. I was still writing towards a teenage audience. Even though my instincts were to go dark with this, I was trying to keep it light enough that it could still work as young adult. I spent 2016 working on this idea. It got dark. 2016 was not a good year for me. So I'm working on Have Heart. I've decided it's a ghost story. I know it has heavy themes, and I was going through a lot of heavy stuff in my own life. I had just lost my grandfather. I moved out of a nice place I was living in. I had been making decent money from Happy Face in Wintertown, but that kind of dried up. And by 2016, I couldn't afford where I was living. I had to move into a little apartment. It was a downgrade. I lost my job shortly after. My car broke down and I lost my car. I was paying way too much for a new car. And on top of all that, I was in a bad relationship at a very down time in my life. A lot of stuff was not going right for me, and I was working on this story. And I think sometimes writing can be therapeutic, and and a lot of how you're feeling and what you're going through can end up on the page. So I ended up writing a long outline. I did both sides of the story. It was very dark. I went full horror with it. It was very disturbing, bloody, and just dark. It was like an indie horror film that I could not get anybody interested in. The young adult publishing was just like, that's not going to go on the shelves there. It's not going to be in libraries and bookstores and stuff. You've written something that's pretty dark. It's more of a indie movie or something like that. So I was kind of embarrassed by it. I ended up kind of just shelving. I ended up just kind of shelving what I had done. I was kind of ashamed, and I put it away once again. So Have Heart once again put into that shelf. Had to wait. It wasn't the time. So after a couple of years working on a completely different project that didn't really go anywhere, Chandra pitched the idea of doing Machina Corpse to me, of doing this kind of spooky comics publishing thing. I was interested in the idea, and one of the first things I thought of was Have Heart, that I had this book that I had fully plotted that was really kind of dark horror that I could not get into the young adult realm, but maybe it would work really good as a comic. Like, I loved the story. I loved the characters. I thought it was insanely creative. I thought it was one of the best things I had done, honestly. It just wasn't your typical young adult, high school slice of life thing. It was something really weird and out there and dark, but it would make a good movie. It would make a good comic book. So I thought this was a chance to dust it off and take another stab at it. So I started thinking of Have Heart, dusting it off from what it was, taking the parts I still really loved, and then figuring out how to put those together, maybe in a new way. I got rid of the dual Mobius strip book idea. I decided I'd do it as a webcomic because I haven't published anything in about 4 or 5 years. And I feel like I especially haven't done a comic book in over a decade. And I feel like I need to reintroduce myself as a comic creator, as an artist. I need to re-find my audience, and I wanted to do this as something free and online that ideally down the road I could collect into a book. I had the idea of, instead of doing it as the 2 stories it initially was, doing it as a triptych, as 3 stories. Kind of this main story that I want to tell, and then these 2 reflections of it. Kind of looking at the same theme from different angles. But I think through Machina Corpse and the internet, I have the form that I need to tell this story and to find the people that are going to love this story and champion it. It needs to find its people and its home. And that's my hope, is that I can prove there is an audience for this, that it is a good idea, and that there are people out there that want to read it.